The first snowfall in Loch Dhu uncovers something far darker than winter's calm, drawing Hamish Macbeth into a quiet mystery. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy settling into these Highland mysteries, subscribe and make this part of your nightly ritual. Only 11% are subscribed while 89% aren't, and your support truly really means a lot. A thin drizzle hung over Loch Dubh, the sort that seemed to rise from the ground as much as it fell from the sky. Hamish Macbeth stood outside his police station, lanky as ever, hands shoved deep into his pockets while Lugs trotted a few steps ahead, nose lifted to catch the cold scent wafting from the loch. The dog paused, sniffed, and looked back with a faint whine, as if the morning itself felt wrong. "Aye, I know," Hamish murmured, his voice soft, nearly swallowed by the mist. "But we'll see what the day wants." The village was more awake than usual for such a grey morning. Hamish could hear crofters muttering near the jetty, their voices sharp with complaint, and somewhere up the hill a metal pot clanged against stone, followed by a woman shouting something about lunacy among the beasts. The air smelled of damp wool and peat smoke, both comforting and slightly accusing, as though Loch Dubh had already decided someone was to blame for whatever was happening. He walked Lugs toward the square, where Patel was standing outside his shop with his arms folded, watching the scene like a man forced to supervise nonsense he hadn't agreed to. When he saw Hamish, he waved him over with dramatic resignation. "Morning, Hamish. You'll not believe the sight we've had." "I might," Hamish said dryly. "Folk have been loud enough about it already." Patel nodded toward the Kirk Hall. "Sheep. Half a flock of them came barrelling through as if chased by the devil, knocked over my sandwich board, made tourists scream, and left droppings everywhere. Colin MacLean should be ashamed." Hamish studied the ground where clumps of wool and fresh hoof prints were pressed into the mud. "Colin's sheep didn't come down this far on their own." "Well, something sent them," Patel said, "and I hope you find out what before the whole village turns into a petting zoo." The drizzle thickened into a fine mist that curled around the stone buildings. Villagers lingered at doorways and windows, their eyes bright with speculation. Hamish could almost feel the gossip spreading like smoke. Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, leaned out of the post office and announced that she'd heard old Colin had been drinking again and left the gate open. A tourist insisted it must have been a wild dog attack. Someone else claimed the sheep were just unsettled by last night's wind, though the air had barely stirred. Hamish said nothing. Gossip was useful, but only when left to stew for a while. Lugs tugged ahead, nose low to the ground. Hamish followed the dog past the square through a line of gorse bushes that prickled with moisture. The loch lay ahead, grey and sullen, its surface rippling under the faintest breeze. The further they walked, the more Hamish sensed the odd tension in Lugs's steps. The dog's ears shifted, catching sounds Hamish could not hear. Then they saw it. A single sheep crouched near the waterline, sides trembling, wool matted with something darker than rain. At first Hamish thought it injured, but when he crouched beside it, he saw only a smear of blood across the flank, as though the animal had brushed against something rather than bled itself. The sheep bleated in a pitiful, urgent way that set Hamish's nerves on edge. "Easy there," he said, stroking its head. "What have you been running from?" Lugs growled softly and nosed the wet ground. A thin trail of red stained the reeds leading toward the loch, faint but certain. Hamish stood, wiping his hand on his coat, and pushed through the reeds. The cold water seeped into his boots, making him wince. The smell of the loch, damp plants, mud, old water, rose around him. Then he saw the shape, a man's body slumped forward, half submerged among the reeds, face turned slightly to the side. His red hair stuck to his forehead as he leaned closer, blinking through the drizzle. The man's jacket was soaked, one sleeve twisted unnaturally as though he had been dragged. Hamish swallowed a quiet sigh. He knew him. Gavin Forbes, the newcomer with big talk about buying land, modernising crofts, and turning Loch Dubh into the next Highland destination. A man full of bright plans and little understanding of where he'd planted himself. Hamish crouched, careful not to disturb the scene more than necessary, though he knew Blair would insist he had trampled evidence the moment he arrived. The reeds around Gavin were bent as if something, or someone, had struggled here. A rock lay near the man's head, darkened with water. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to trouble Hamish. He glanced around. No signs of footprints, the rain had seen to that, but the sheep trail leading straight to the water suggested panic rather than grazing. Lugs barked once, sharp and uneasy. "Aye," Hamish said softly. Something frightened them, and something frightened him. Gavin looked strangely small in the shallows, as if all his big plans had drained away with the tide. There was no grandeur and death here, only cold water and an indifferent sky. Hamish felt a pang of sympathy. Outsiders seldom understood the village, and the village seldom understood them. He straightened slowly, joints stiff with cold. There was only one thing left to do, and he dreaded it. The very thought of Blair stomping into Loughdub filled him with quiet misery. Back at the police station, Hamish lifted the landline receiver, which crackled as though protesting the weather. He dialed Strathbane, waiting through the sluggish ring. He could picture the fluorescent lighting already, harsh and unwelcoming. "Strathbane Police, Anderson speaking." "Anderson, it's Hamish Macbeth. I found a body near the loch, Gavin Forbes." There was a pause, then a flurry of muffled voices in the background. Anderson's tone sharpened with officious energy. "Inspector Blair will be informed immediately." "Aye," Hamish muttered. "I thought as much." "You are to preserve the scene and not interfere further," Anderson added, as if reading from a script. Hamish hung up before he could respond, leaning briefly against the wall. He knew Blair would arrive in the foulest of moods, eager to accuse Hamish of incompetence, eager to trample over every inch of the reeds with his size 10 boots. Lugs nudged Hamish's leg, sensing his frustration. The dog's warm weight grounded him, a reminder that part of his work, perhaps the most important part, was simply to keep Loughdub safe from fools as much as from criminals. He stepped back outside into the drizzle. A narrow plume of smoke rose from his peat stove chimney, mixing with the mist. From across the square, a few villagers pretended to look elsewhere while watching him in that careful Highland manner, polite, curious, and full of judgment all at once. Mrs. Macbeth from the post office called out, "Is it true about the sheep killing a man, Hamish?" "No," Hamish said mildly. "The sheep are innocent so far." This answer did nothing to calm her. She vanished back inside, no doubt already revising the details for her next retelling. A crofter hurried past with a sack of feed, muttering, "Mark my words, Hamish. Forbes had enemies. You don't come to Loughdub with grand ideas and expect folk to smile." Hamish didn't argue. He merely stored the comment away, another stitch in the tapestry of village sentiment. Fear, pride, resentment, such things simmered quietly in rural places, and they often boiled over for reasons outsiders never saw coming. He looked toward the loch, its surface now smoothing as the rain lightened. The reeds swayed gently, concealing Gavin's stillness beneath their trembling tips. A strange hush settled over the landscape, as though Loughdub itself were holding its breath. Hamish brushed rain from his brow and took a long, steadying breath of cold, damp air. The case would bring Blair crashing into the village with accusations, bluster, and the usual determination to humiliate him. Villagers would tighten their lips, sharing truths only in whispers. Lugs would sense trouble before Hamish did, as always. But for now, there was only the quiet loch, the restless sheep, and the slow certainty that something dark had passed through Loughdub in the night. He stepped inside the station and closed the door just as the first sound of a distant engine rumbled along the washed-out road from Strathbane. The day had begun. The mist had thickened by the time Hamish reached the edge of the square again, the sort of dense, creeping vapour that made even familiar shapes seem uncertain. The loch lay hidden beneath the greyness, and the road from Strathbane was a wavering line disappearing into the clouds. Lug sat at Hamish's heel, head tilted toward the distant rumble of an engine labouring up the hill. The dog gave a single, disgruntled huff. "Aye," Hamish said quietly. "That'll be Blair, right enough." The engine grew louder, drowning out the soft lap of water and the muttering of villagers. A police car burst through the fog like an irritated beetle, swerving unnecessarily before screeching to a halt beside the Kirk Hall. Inspector Blair heaved himself out, scowling as if Loughdub had personally wronged him. Anderson scrambled after him, almost tripping over his own feet in his eagerness to follow. Blair spotted Hamish and let out a bark of displeasure. "Macbeth, you haul me all the way here for a shepherd accident. This had better not be another one of your daft notions." Hamish kept his voice mild. "It's no accident, sir. Best you come and look." "Oh, I will," Blair snapped, slamming the car door. "And I expect everything untouched, though with you about, God knows what's been trampled. Anderson clucked sympathetically, shooting Hamish a smug glance as though taking part in a schoolyard rivalry. They marched toward the lockside reeds. Blair's boots squelched aggressively in the mud, each step a protest. When he reached Gavin's body, now respectfully covered with a sheet, his bluster faltered for a moment. A gleam of satisfaction crossed his face. Something serious had happened, something he could grandstand over. "Well now," Blair said softly, lifting the sheet with a grunt. "Would you look at that? And you're telling me sheep didn't do it?" Hamish ignored the taunt. "There are drag marks there," he said, pointing, "and the sheep ran downhill in a panic. They don't do that without cause." Blair waved a hand. "You read too much into animal nonsense. Looks like the fool slipped. Probably drunk. Probably pestering the locals again. I'll have this wrapped in an hour." Anderson bobbed his head. "Very likely, sir. Very likely indeed." Lugs whined, low and uneasy. Blair shot him a sour look. "And keep that mangy thing away from the body." Hamish kept his face expressionless, though a flicker of annoyance pressed behind his eyes. "Lugs is never a bother." "That mutt's a menace," Blair muttered. A sudden ring from Blair's mobile car radio sliced through the fog. He snatched it up with a grunt. Whatever voice came through made him stiffen. Hamish could make out only fragments, but the clip's tone was unmistakable. Chief Superintendent Daviot. Blair's expression tightened with each second. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir. It'll be handled properly." When the line went dead, Blair puffed his cheeks like a disgruntled bull. "Daviot wants a clean report. No village folk interfering. No Macbeth theories." Hamish gave a small nod. He had long ago learned not to argue openly with Blair. Quiet persistence achieved more. The villagers had begun to gather again, drifting toward the loch edge in cautious clusters. Crofters stood with their hands shoved into worn pockets. Fishers leaned on the railings with narrowed eyes, and a pair of tourists from the hotel whispered behind gloved hands. The gossip had thickened faster than the mist. Mrs. Wellington announced to anyone listening, "I heard Gavin was attacked by wild dogs. Terrible business. Dogs have been restless lately." Patel countered sharply, "Nonsense. Man like him, he was arguing with someone last night. Eiley said he came in red-faced." A fisherman shook his head. "The man fell in drunk. I saw him staggering past the jetty before closing." None of it was consistent, and none of it sounded quite right. Hamish listened, storing each odd detail. Villagers never lied intentionally, but truth always passed through their own grudges first. Just then a familiar figure approached through the swirling fog. Priscilla Halberton Smythe, wrapped in a cream-coloured coat, her blonde hair pinned neatly away from the damp. Her breath misted in front of her, and her steps were soft, as though she didn't wish to disturb the quiet. "Hamish," she said gently, "I heard something had happened." Her voice brought a subtle tightening to his chest, the sort he pushed down as a matter of habit. "I, Gavin Forbes, found by the water." Her eyes lowered. "I'm sorry to hear it. He spoke to me once at the hotel. Something about land sales. He seemed driven, but uneasy too." Hamish watched her face carefully. She offered nothing more. Priscilla was not a woman who wasted words, nor was she one to indulge curiosity merely for gossip. Still, he sensed she was holding back small impressions, not out of secrecy but gentleness. "Did he trouble you?" Hamish asked. "No," she said. "But he struck me as a man who didn't understand where he was." Hamish huffed a quiet breath. Most newcomers don't. For a moment they stood side by side, the cold loch air swirling around them. There was no drama, no romance, just that familiar, quiet distance neither seemed willing to cross. Then she gave a faint incline of her head. "You'll work it out, Hamish. You always do." She walked away, her calm figure fading into the mist, leaving him lonelier than before. Blair stomped back toward them, red-faced. "Bodies away!" he barked to Anderson, who scrambled to obey. As Gavin's form was lifted, Lugs let out a soft, miserable whine, pressing against Hamish's leg. It wasn't much, but Hamish felt it settled into him like a warning. He turned toward the cluster of villagers. Investigation waited. Morag Fraser was the first he approached. She stood with her arms folded tightly under her shawl, her face set in that Highland blend of pride and constant irritation. Her hair stuck out damply from beneath her knitted cap. "Morning, Morag," Hamish said gently. "I need a word." She sniffed. "You'll want to talk about that man. I told him last week he'd get nowhere offering me pennies for my father's field." Her tone was blunt, defensive. Hamish noted her boots were clean. She hadn't been near the water this morning. "He meant to buy crofts." "He meant to steal them," Morag snapped. "Called my land underused. Said he could build cabins, bring in tourists. I told him he'd see me in a coffin first." She flushed, embarrassed at her own harshness. "But I didn't lay a finger on him, Hamish. I'm angry, not daft." He believed her. Lugg sniffed her boots and wandered off uninterested. Good sign. Next was Colin McLean, who hovered nearby with a sheepish, literal and figurative look. His clothes were rumpled and a guilty twitch kept passing over his face. "Colin," Hamish said quietly, "Gavin troubled you?" Colin rubbed the back of his neck. "He wandered near my pens last week. Told me half the sheep were grazing over the wrong boundary. He didn't ken what he was talking about, but he made threats. Said he'd bring in surveyors." "He frighten you?" Hamish asked. Colin's jaw clenched. "Nae man frightens me, but he was a meddler, and meddling folk find trouble." Hamish filed that tone away, defensive, irritated, but not broken. Colin was lying about something, though perhaps not murder. Finally he approached Eilidh Cameron outside the hotel, her dark hair tied back, her apron damp where she'd been wiping down tables. She greeted him with a weary sigh. "He made plenty of enemies," she said before he even asked. "Charm to the tourists, but sharp as vinegar to locals. Last night he complained about the draught in the dining room, then accused old Mr. Murray of staring at him. There was always something." "Anyone see him leave?" Hamish said. "Not that I know of, but someone mentioned he was arguing with a stranger near the loch. Could be rubbish. Folks say anything after 2 whiskies." Hamish saw the honesty in her eyes, the weariness too. She wasn't hiding anything. The fog thickened again, rolling over the loch in slow waves. Crofters still muttered, tourists still gawked, Blair still blustered. But beneath all the noise, Hamish felt the shape of something quiet and uneasy forming. Gavin Forbes had pushed too hard. Someone had pushed back. He looked toward the reeds where Gavin had lain. The water was calm now, but the memory clung like damp wool. Luggs nudged his hand, tail low. "Aye," Hamish whispered. "We're in it now." The drizzle eased by late morning, though the clouds still clung low over the hills like a herd of grey beasts refusing to be moved on. Hamish stepped out of the station with Luggs at his side, breathing in the cold, damp air that carried the faintest smell of peat smoke from scattered chimneys. The world felt washed, but not clean. Loch had a prickly stillness to it, the kind that came when folk were trying very hard to pretend nothing unusual had happened. Luggs paused, ears twitching at every distant sound, the creak of the jetty, a door shutting too quickly, whispers carried on the moist wind. Hamish rubbed the dog's head. "Aye, they're all rattled. You and me both." He set off along the narrow path that wound between cottages and down toward the lower road. Curtains twitched as he passed. Villagers who would normally nod or comment on the weather suddenly busied themselves with sweeping steps or rearranging flower pots that didn't need rearranging. The gossip had moved past the first noisy flurry and into its quieter, more dangerous stage, the whispering behind half-shut doors. A pair of tourists from the hotel stood at the post office, speaking too loudly. "I heard the man was dragged underwater," one said. "Terrible. Should have more lights along the loch, if you ask me." Hamish didn't correct them. Truth would drift to the surface soon enough, and tourists had a habit of adding spice to even the blandest tale. He continued on, casting a weary glance toward the Kirk Hall where Blair was stomping about, taking statements with all the delicacy of a bulldozer. Anderson fluttered behind him like an anxious gull, repeating everything Blair said as though afraid silence might be mistaken for disloyalty. A few villagers endured the questioning with tight smiles, protective of Hamish and none too pleased to have Strathbane men sticking their noses in. Hamish turned away before Blair could spot him. He had work of his own to do, and little of it involved formal questioning. A stroll, a chat, a bit of listening. That was how Loch gave up its secrets. Gavin Forbes's rented cottage stood on the edge of the village, tucked beside a scraggly hedge that had lost most of its leaves. Hamish approached slowly, noting the churned soil beside the path, as though someone had paced there in agitation. Lugg sniffed the ground, tail stiff, then trotted ahead. Inside, the cottage smelled faintly of damp wool, and the stubborn optimism of someone trying to impose grand ideas on a place that didn't want them. Hamish stepped into the front room. Maps lay sprawled across the table, some of Loughdub, others of the broader region, marked with untidy scribbles. Letters from estate agents were piled beside an ashtray full of half-smoked cigarettes. On the desk, a typed proposal caught his eye. Luxury Highland escape, a modern visitor experience. He felt his stomach sink. No wonder the villagers had disliked the man. A torn envelope lay on the floor near the door, its corner ripped as though snatched hastily. Hamish turned it over. The stamp was local. Someone had visited, or left something, recently. Luggs gave a soft bark from the doorway and trotted toward the back garden. Hamish followed him to the shed. The door was slightly ajar and the smell of old wood and oil seeped out. Luggs nosed around the hinges, then tugged gently at something caught on a nail. A scrap of fabric, dark and woolen. Hamish eased it off and slipped it into his pocket. The wind rustled the hedge, carrying with it the distant sound of Blair shouting at someone. He didn't want Blair near this clue yet, not until he knew what it meant. Back in the village, Hamish made his way toward Morag Fraser's croft. The walk steadied him, letting his thoughts line themselves up with the rhythm of his steps. Mist clung to the fields and the chill seeped through his coat, but the solitude comforted him. Here, without Blair's bluster, he could think. Morag was waiting in her yard as if she'd known he was coming. She stood with her broad shoulders set squarely, her expression sour as old vinegar. Her sheep milled nervously behind her, bleating at the cold. "You'll be wanting more talk about that troublemaker," she said without greeting. "I'm wanting whatever you can tell me," Hamish replied gently. Morag sniffed and folded her arms. "That man came to my door 3 times this month. 3. Tried to buy my field for a pittance. Said he'd take me to court for blocking development." Her voice shook with anger, not loud but deep-seated. "Did he threaten you?" "Threaten?" She spat on the ground. "He tried. Told me I'd regret refusing him. I told him the only thing I regret is him setting foot in Loughdub." Hamish studied her face. Pride, fear, resentment all knotted together. Morag was fierce but fair, someone who fought with words, not blows. "Where were you last night?" "In my bed," she said bluntly. "Ask anyone. My sister stayed over. She snores like a dying cow. Whole village could hear." Hamish almost smiled. It was likely true. He thanked her and moved on, Luggs trotting faithfully beside him. The mist was lifting now, revealing the distant hills in soft outlines. A crow cawed from a bare branch, shaking droplets onto Hamish's collar. Colin MacLean's croft lay further along the road. Colin stood by his sheep pens, looking more nervous than his animals. His jacket was buttoned wrong, and his hands twitched at the seams. "Hamish," he said, forcing a grin. "Terrible business." "Aye, terrible." Hamish kept his voice calm. "You had trouble with Forbes?" Colin's grin faded. "The man accused me of keeping sheep on the wrong boundary. Said the stone was set in the wrong place and half my grazing ground was actually his. Imagine that. The cheek of him." "And what did you say?" "That he should mind his own affairs," Colin muttered. "He came round in the evening waving papers. I told him to leave before I lost my temper." Hamish's gaze drifted to the torn hem of Colin's jacket, a tear shaped not unlike the fabric scrap in his pocket. "You seem jumpy, Colin." Colin stiffened. "I've nothing to hide." Hamish didn't push. He let the silence carry the weight instead. A good silence could shake more truth loose than a dozen questions. Eventually Colin looked away, blinking hard. "Folk hated him, Hamish," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean we'd kill him." Hamish nodded. "I know." Back in the village, he found Eileith Cameron sweeping the hotel steps with brisk, irritated strokes. She stopped when she saw him, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "He brought it on himself," she said before Hamish asked anything. "Charming to strangers, but rude as sin to us. Complained about the rooms, the food, the people. He even said Loughdub needed modernising, imagine that." "He upset many," Hamish said softly. "He upset me," she admitted. "But I never once wished him dead." Hamish believed her. Eileigh's temper was quick, but her conscience was strong. Just as he was turning to leave, Mrs. Curry appeared beside him as if conjured from the mist. She narrowed her sharp eyes and leaned close. "I'll tell you what everyone else is avoiding," she hissed. "He was far too friendly with a married woman. Saw them laughing together one night, far beyond innocent. Mark my words. Hamish sighed inwardly. Gossip again. Who was the woman? Oh, I won't say, Mrs. Curry declared, chin lifted. Not my place. Which meant she didn't know, only suspected. By the time Hamish left the hotel steps, afternoon had begun its slow slide toward evening. The light dimmed early this time of year, leaching the colour from the village until houses, hills and loch all merged into shades of steel. He walked the long way home, letting the quiet of the moor path settle around him. Lugs padded beside him, occasionally stopping to sniff the ground. The wind carried the crisp scent of heather mixed with something else, old tension maybe, the kind that clung to land disputes and long-held grudges. Gavin Forbes had stirred up trouble more deeply than he'd realised. Land, boundaries, pride, shame. Lochdubb was full of such fault lines. It had always been that way. As Hamish neared the station, he paused, glancing at the fabric scrap in his pocket. A small piece of truth, sharp as a thorn. Not enough for an answer, but enough for a direction. Lugs nudged Hamish's leg, whining softly as the wind shifted. Aye, Hamish murmured. Something's brewing yet. The mist settled again over the loch, thick and uninviting. The day felt unfinished, like a story determined to drag him deeper before it let him go. Rain returned before dawn, soft but persistent, the kind that soaked through wool and patience alike. By the time Hamish stepped out of the station with Lugs at his side, the drops had turned the village lanes into thin ribbons of darkened stone, shining faintly under the grey morning light. The loch was blurred at the edges, its surface ruffled by the steady drizzle, and a faint smell of peat smoke drifted from a few chimneys, fighting the damp with stubborn Highland resolve. Hamish tucked his hands deeper into his pockets. He felt the heaviness of the air, an unease that clung like fog. Lugs halted at the path's edge, tail low, listening to something Hamish couldn't hear. Aye, you're right, Hamish murmured. Folk are wound tight today. He made his way toward the hotel first. Tourists were often the most eager witnesses and the least reliable. As he entered the lobby, he heard voices drifting from the breakfast room, low, dramatic, and distinctly English. A middle-aged man with a large raincoat and an expression of constant alarm spotted Hamish and waved him over as though delivering urgent wartime intelligence. "Officer! Officer! Macbeth, isn't it?" He leaned forward, eyes popping with conviction. "I saw him. Forbes, last night. He met someone near the loch, a dark figure, very sinister." Hamish kept his tone polite. "A dark figure? Did you recognise them?" No, but they were tall or short. Hard to say in this dreadful fog. But they were arguing. Definitely arguing. Lugs, lying beside Hamish's chair, gave a soft snort. Hamish tried again. "Where exactly did you see them?" The man gestured vaguely toward every direction at once. Down by the water, or perhaps the path near the kirk. "I had a dram or two after dinner, of course, purely to warm the bones." Hamish felt the first prick of dry humour stir. "And after the warming?" "Well, things were blurrier. But I know I saw a figure, shadowy, menacing." Hamish listened for inconsistencies. There were plenty. By the end of the conversation, the mysterious figure had grown from shadowy to wearing a long dark coat, then somehow, perhaps carrying a lantern. The man's story folded and reshaped itself like cheap paper, altered by whiskey and eagerness. "Thank you," Hamish said gently, standing. "You've been helpful." He didn't add in your own way. Lugs trotted after him, ears tilted sideways in canine disbelief. Outside, the rain thickened again. Hamish pulled up his collar and walked toward the hotel's lounge, where Priscilla had asked to meet him. She stood near the window, looking out at the blurred village. Her posture was calm as always, elegant without effort. "You're drenched," she said softly. "It's Lochdubb," Hamish replied, running a hand through his red hair. "We'd worry if it weren't raining." A faint smile touched her lips. On the table lay Gavin Forbes's maps, the ones Hamish had brought from the cottage. Priscilla touched one lightly with the tip of her finger. He marked the same boundary lines again and again, obsessive almost. "He was pushing folk hard," Hamish said. "Did he seem nervous when you saw him?" Priscilla nodded. "Very. He kept glancing at the door whenever someone walked in, as if expecting someone to confront him." Hamish looked at her, admiring, not for the first time, how carefully she weighed her words. She was never one to exaggerate, never one to indulge the drama that captured Lochtub so easily. "You think he feared someone?" Hamish asked. "I think," she said slowly, "that he misunderstood the strength of feeling in this place. But yes, he seemed afraid." Her eyes met his for a moment, and he felt that familiar current of tension, gentle and troubling. She stepped back from the table, putting a quiet distance between them. "You'll find the truth, Hamish, you always do." She left with the soft rustle of her coat, disappearing into the grey morning. Hamish folded the maps and returned to the square, lugs padding beside him. Blair was outside Patel's shop, bellowing at Anderson over a soggy sheet of paper. "This is evidence," Blair snapped, waving a postcard so violently it nearly tore. "From Inverness, unsigned, telling the dead man to drop the matter. Doesn't that scream criminal dealings to you?" Anderson bobbed eagerly. "Yes, sir. Very suspicious. Very criminal." Hamish approached quietly. Blair turned, face already sour. "Don't think you're helping, Macbeth. This proves Forbes was involved in something dodgy." Hamish read the postcard briefly. "Could be anything. A warning from a landowner, a prank, maybe a tourist he annoyed. It's vague." Blair puffed up. "You always try to make things smaller than they are. That's why you'll always be stuck in this backwater station." Hamish smiled mildly. "Aye, sir, I like backwaters." Blair snorted. "I'm close to cracking this," he boasted loudly, loud enough for the villagers nearby to hear. "A criminal conspiracy, likely murder tied to organised—" Hamish tuned him out. Blair's certainty always increased in direct proportion to his wrongness. Inside the station, still cold from the poor insulation, Hamish inspected Gavin's coat again. The faint chemical tang clung to it unmistakably. "Sheep dip," Hamish muttered. "Why in the world?" The smell was subtle, buried beneath the scent of wet wool. Blair had ignored it. Hamish doubted the man had ever stood close enough to livestock to recognise anything. But someone had handled Gavin roughly, and near sheep. Luggs tilted his head, nose wrinkling. "You smell it too," Hamish said. "Good lad." When they stepped back outside, Colin McLean appeared from behind the corner of Patel's shop. His usual greeting, the forced grin, was absent. He tried to walk past Hamish without meeting his eyes. Luggs froze. His posture stiffened, almost bristling. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Hamish jerked slightly, surprised. Luggs rarely growled at anyone in Lochtub. Colin stopped, face paling. "Control your dog," he snapped too quickly. "He's fine," Hamish said quietly. "Just reading folk. He's good at that." Colin swallowed hard. Rain ran down his cheeks, giving him an oddly stricken look. Without another word, he hurried off, boots splashing in the puddles. Hamish watched him go. Luggs sat down beside him, still watchful. "Aye," Hamish murmured. "I saw that too." He walked the length of the jetty to clear his thoughts. Something he never admitted aloud helped him think. The rain thinned to a mist that hung like breath above the water. Small waves lapped against the wooden posts, creaking softly under the weight of time. The whole village was tangled now, landowners clutching old grudges, newcomers assuming too much, gossip twisting between truth and fiction. But something deeper than land disputes unsettled the air. Hamish leaned a hand against the rail. He was afraid, he murmured, more than a man worried about property deals. The sheep dip, the jumpiness, the glances over his shoulder, the postcard telling him to drop the matter. Someone had pushed Gavin Forbes far harder than the village had admitted. Footsteps approached behind him. Patel's voice carried on the damp wind. "Macbeth, Blair's threatening to confiscate my shop ledger. Says it may contain names of criminals." Hamish sighed. "I'm sure he'll calm down." "He never calms down," Patel muttered. "He only inflates." Hamish gave a small smile. "Leave him be for now. He'll tire himself soon." When Patel left, shaking his head, Hamish gazed again at the loch. Luggs pressed against his leg, warm and solid. "I think Gavin knew something," Hamish said softly, "or someone made him think he did." Thunder muttered far away over the hills, though the rain stayed light. The air darkened subtly, as though the land itself wished to keep its secrets. "Come on, boy," Hamish said at last. "There's more to ask, and more folk hiding the pieces." Luggs rose, giving a final growl toward the road Colin had taken earlier. Hamish felt that tiny shift inside him, a quiet certainty that something older, knottier, and far more human than any postcard was at the heart of Gavin's death. He turned back toward the village, the mist thickening behind him. The truth was out there, buried under pride, fear, and old Highland grudges. He could feel the shape of it now, just not yet the face. Fog rolled in thick and low across the moors, drifting like pale ghosts over the heather. Hamish walked slowly along the faint track leading toward Morag Fraser's croft, Lugs trotting slightly ahead, his paws silent on the damp earth. The world felt muffled, no birdsong, no distant bleating, only the soft hiss of mist brushing against grass. Loughdub had its moods, and today it was keeping its secrets close. Hamish felt the strange hush settling into his bones. It was the sort of quiet that made a man think, though he tried not to think too loudly. His inner thoughts were short things, quick observations that passed through him like the wind. Still, the idea of Gavin Forbes poking into old feuds gnawed at him. Morag's croft emerged from the fog like a dark, squat shape. The stone walls glistened with moisture, and the roof sagged slightly at the corners. Her sheep bunched together near the fence, stamping nervously, their wool wet and clumped. Lugs gave them one pointed look and sat down as if deciding they weren't worth the trouble. Morag appeared at the door, hands on hips, face hard as winter ice. She watched Hamish approach with the air of someone who expected trouble and intended to handle it with blunt words. "You're out early," she said, "though I suppose murder keeps a constable busy." Hamish offered a gentle nod. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" "You'll come in whether I mind or not," she said, softening only slightly. "Come on then, and wipe your boots. I've enough muck in my house without you adding more." Inside, the croft was tidy in Morag's particular stubborn way. A peat fire smouldered in the grate, sending up curls of fragrant smoke that mixed with the damp chill sneaking in through the stones. Hamish stood near the warmth, letting his coat drip a little onto the worn rug. Morag busied herself with the kettle, her shoulders tight beneath her wool jumper. "You're here about him," she said. "The man who thought he could buy Loughdub." "Aye. You said before he annoyed you. I'm looking to understand just how much." Morag let out a huff that was half laugh, half sigh. "You want honesty, Hamish? He didn't just annoy me. He insulted my family, accused my late father of lying, of hiding a boundary stone years ago to steal grazing land." Hamish raised his eyebrows. "That's a serious accusation." "Aye," she snapped, "and one he flung at me as if I'd been in on some grand conspiracy. My father, a good man, worked that land fair and square. He fought with the weather and the soil, not his neighbours." Hamish watched her carefully. Beneath the anger he sensed something else, a tremor of old shame, not because she believed the accusation, but because she feared others might. Highland pride mixed with Highland grief. "Did you tell him to back off?" Hamish asked. "I told him cows would fly before I gave him an inch of my land, and I told him my father wasn't alive to defend himself from such nonsense." She paused, face tightening. "But I didn't touch him, Hamish. You know me. I might shout and throw a look that could blister paint, but I don't kill folk." Hamish believed her. Lugs, who had wandered over to sniff a pair of muddy boots, lifted his head and gave a quiet wag. If the dog felt no danger here, Hamish took note. After finishing her tea without offering him any, Morag's way of showing honesty by not bothering with niceties, Hamish stepped back into the fog. Lugs pressed close to his leg. The mist seemed to trouble the dog, though not enough to make him whine. Colin MacLean's croft lay a short walk away, up a gentle rise where the fog thinned just enough to reveal the shape of a broken fence and a leaning shed. Colin stood outside, fiddling nervously with a length of twine. When he saw Hamish, he straightened, plastering on a grin too wide to be real. "Constable, fine morning, eh?" Hamish looked around at the fog that clung to everything like wet wool. "If you say so, Colin." Colin chuckled weakly. "What brings you out this way?" "You know well enough." Hamish kept his voice soft, almost kind. "Gavin Forbes gave you trouble too." Colin swallowed hard. "I told you. He said the boundary was wrong. Said half my grazing land was stolen generations ago. Utter nonsense." Hamish's gaze drifted to the torn jacket hanging near Colin's door, its sleeve ripped at the exact angle matching the fabric scrap Lugs had found at Gavin's shed. He stepped closer. "That jacket's seen better days." Colin followed his gaze, face tightening. "Och, that's old damage. Ripped it weeks ago, climbing the stone wall near the burn." Hamish tilted his head, the picture of mild doubt. "That right?" "Aye," Colin said quickly. "Bad luck, that. Near ruined the whole thing. Lug sat beside Hamish and stared directly at Colin, ears forward, body tense. The silence stretched, thick as the fog. Colin shuffled, looking anywhere but at the dog. Finally Hamish said, "You were angry with Forbes. Everyone knows that, Colin. But being angry and being guilty are two different things." Colin exhaled heavily, shoulders slumping. "He got under my skin, Hamish. Said he'd take everything I had. But I never harmed him. I swear it." Hamish didn't reply. He simply nodded and turned away, letting the weight of his silence settle on Colin like dew. Lugs gave Colin one last, piercing look before following his master down the track. As they made their way back toward the heart of the village, the fog grew thicker still, settling in soft folds around the heather. Hamish felt the unease growing, not fear, but the sense of old wounds being reopened by someone who didn't understand the land he was poking at. At Patel's shop, Hamish stopped for a quick chat. The bell above the door tinkled faintly, though the shop was dim, lit only by a small lamp that flickered every so often. Patel looked up from the counter, his face creased with a mixture of curiosity and irritation. "You look like a drenched scarecrow," Patel remarked. "What now?" "Just asking about Forbes," Hamish said. Patel snorted. "He bought up every book I had on local history. Wanted to know about disputes, old land holdings, croft boundaries. He said the past mattered more than folk realized." Hamish frowned. "Did he say why?" Patel shrugged. "Something about proving things. He spoke as if he already knew the answers and just needed proof. Strange man. Too confident." Hamish thanked him and stepped back into the fog, Lugs brushing against his leg. The dog's tail swayed slowly, as if sensing Hamish's deepening thoughts. They wandered near the loch before returning to the station. Rain had begun again, just a drizzle at first, then a heavier patter. The reeds swayed gently in the wind, their tops slick with moisture. Hamish walked along the water's edge, eyes scanning the shoreline. Lugs led him to a patch of disturbed earth, mud darker than the rest, as though something had recently shifted. Hamish crouched. There, half hidden beneath reeds, was a rock, square, weathered, and clearly out of place. When he lifted it, the mud beneath showed a perfect square outline. A boundary stone moved, a motive older than half the village. He set the stone down carefully and stood, quiet dread pressing into his thoughts. Forbes hadn't just angered people. He'd dug into history, into pride, into buried shame. Lugs whined softly, the sound low and uneasy. Hamish looked back toward the village, its cottages blurred by fog, its people holding tight to their grievances. "Aye," he whispered, "this wasn't just business. It was personal, for somebody." He turned away from the loch, the fog swallowing him and Lugs as they headed back toward the waiting shadows of Loch Dubh. The sky cleared for a brief, deceptive hour the next morning, the kind of crisp highland brightness that felt more like a pause in the weather than any real change. Sunlight glimmered weakly off the loch, turning the surface into a sheet of pale silver. The air, though, still held the cold bite of the night before, and mist clung low to the reeds as if reluctant to leave. Hamish walked along the path with Lugs at his side, the dog trotting with an odd alertness, ears flicking at every stir of grass. The quiet stretched around them, soft, wary, as though the whole village waited for something to show itself properly. Then Hamish saw them. A small cluster of sheep stood near the water's edge, heads bowed, noses testing the ground. Not grazing, sniffing, searching. The same sheep that had fled through the village 2 days before. He recognized the distinct mottling on one ewe's flank. "Well now," Hamish murmured. "What brings you back?" Lugs barked once, sharp and uneasy. Hamish scanned the ground. Hoofprints crowded the mud, but their angles told him something important. These weren't the wandering, aimless tracks of grazing animals. These were clustered, frantic indentations, the marks of sheep running. "Fleeing from something," Hamish said aloud. "Not toward it." He crouched, fingers brushing the disturbed soil. The sheep nearest him bleated and shifted nervously, but did not run this time. Whatever had terrified them that night was not present now. Lugs moved ahead, nose pressed close to the earth. He followed a line of scuffed mud that led toward a patch of flattened grass. Something glinted faintly near the reeds. Hamish walked over and picked it up, a glove, brown, woolen, soaked slightly from the damp. He turned it over in his hand. Faint streaks of sheep dip clung to the inside seams. He lifted it nearer his nose and inhaled. Beneath the chemical smell lingered something earthy and familiar. Pipe tobacco. He closed his eyes briefly. "Well, Colin MacLean," he said softly, "you've left me a wee present." Only one man in Loch smoked that particular old-fashioned blend, the kind that clung to clothes and lingered like a ghost in the air. Lugs let out a low rumble as though agreeing. Hamish slipped the glove into his pocket, his mind turning over the possibilities. Colin had reason to fear Gavin's meddling. He'd lied about the tear in his jacket. Lugs's instincts had been sharp. But Hamish felt something else resting beneath these clues, a tremor of something more complicated, as though the land dispute was only the topmost story and deeper layers waited beneath. He walked back toward the main road, the sheep now peacefully returning to their grazing. The moment he reached the turning toward the village, he spotted someone waving at him from behind the hedge near a holiday cottage. Mrs. Angela Sinclair, a newcomer, middle-aged, sharp-featured, always wearing a cardigan too thin for Highland weather. She stepped onto the path with a cautious smile. "Constable Macbeth," she said, wringing her hands. I hoped I might speak to you, if it's no bother." "'Tisna a bother," Hamish said softly. "What's troubling you?" "Oh well, it's a silly thing." She tugged her cardigan around herself as though cold. "But I didn't sleep well the night before, before the body was found. And I happened to be looking out the window because the lamp outside was flickering. Terrible wiring here, you know, flickering all the time." Hamish murmured, encouraging and patient. "And I saw someone walking toward Gavin's cottage," she said in a rush, carrying a lantern. Hamish felt the slightest pinch of interest behind his ribs. "Someone?" "Yes, a woman, bundled in a shawl. Had to be Morag Fraser, the build was unmistakable." Hamish kept his expression quiet and unreadable. "You're certain?" Angela shifted uncomfortably, fingernails tapping against her sleeve. "Well, certain-ish. She has that purposeful walk, you know." Then, more weakly, "I think." Hamish studied her closely. Her eyes shifted too much, flitting to the ground and back. Her smile twitched. She was hiding something, not guilt, but a reluctance to say more. "You didn't see her approach Gavin's door?" Hamish asked gently. Angela hesitated. "No, the fog rolled in thick. I only saw her go in that direction, but I thought I should say something for the investigation." Hamish nodded. "Thank you. You've done right." She seemed relieved, but also too eager to leave. She dipped her head and hurried back toward the cottage, closing the door a little too firmly behind her. Lugs whined under his breath. "Aye," Hamish murmured. "I noticed it too." Angela's story contradicted Morag's alibi, but Angela's manner contradicted her own story. Something was off. Rain began again, soft, cold, persistent. Hamish turned his collar up and walked toward the village square. The air smelled of wet slate and loch mist. Footsteps echoed faintly from inside Patel's shop, and a dog barked from far up the hill. Just as Hamish reached the station door, the landline rang, its shrill, cracking tones slicing through the quiet. He stepped inside and answered. Blair's furious voice blasted through the receiver. "Macbeth, have you found anything? Anything at all? I've had a report from Davitt breathing down my neck and Anderson is useless, and you're probably sipping tea while we do the real work." Hamish closed his eyes briefly in weary patience. "Nothing new, sir." "You're lying," Blair snarled. "I heard from someone you were seen rooting around near the loch this morning." "I walk the loch every morning," Hamish said. "Helps me think." "Thinking," Blair scoffed. "A waste of time for the likes of you. If you found evidence, I want it, immediately." Hamish glanced at the glove in his pocket. "There's nothing, sir." The lie slipped out gently, unobtrusively, almost a sigh. Hamish felt a small flicker of guilt, but it passed as quickly as midges on a windy day. Keeping things from Blair wasn't dishonesty, it was protecting Lochdubb from idiocy. Blair continued shouting until Hamish politely ended the call with a murmured, "I'll keep looking, sir," before setting the receiver down. Lugg sat beside him, tail thumping once against the floorboards. Hamish crouched and scratched behind the dog's ear. "Aye, lad. Blair would charge the first person he saw and call it a day. Best he stays hungry for a bit." He straightened and stepped back outside. Rain softened again, turning the village into a canvas of grey and muted sound. But even beneath the drizzle, he sensed tension humming softly across the crofts and cottages. Angela lying, or half-lying, Morag with her old shame and hard pride, Colin with his torn jacket and tobacco-scented glove, the sheep drawn back as if compelled by memory, and Gavin Forbes, stirring every buried grievance he touched. Hamish walked toward the loch once more, the mist rolling in at his ankles. Lugs padded beside him, a steady presence. He felt the pieces shifting, aligning into something more disturbing than he'd expected. Someone frightened the sheep, Hamish whispered to the fog. Someone was where they shouldn't have been, and Gavin saw something, or threatened something, he should have left alone. The loch lay silent, its surface still save for the faint rain ripples. Somewhere out in the mist a gull cried, lonely, distant. Hamish stood there a moment longer, letting the cold seep into him, letting intuition tighten its grip. When he finally turned back toward the village, the drizzle thickened again, swallowing him and Lugs as they headed deeper into the quiet, secretive heart of Loch Dubh. The wind strengthened overnight, tugging at the roofs and rattling loose slates along the main road. By morning the sky had darkened into a heavy, bruised grey, the sort that promised a storm not yet ready to break. Hamish stepped outside the station with Lugs close at his heel. The air felt sharp, restless, stirring the heather and the nerves of anyone with sense enough to feel the weather's warnings. Hamish breathed in the cold loch air, the scent of damp stone rising from the ground. Lugs gave a low whine, not fear, but uncertainty. The dog's instincts often ran ahead of Hamish's thoughts, and today that unease worked its way beneath the constable's ribs. "Come on, lad," he murmured. "Let's see about Morag." The wind pushed them along the path toward Morag Fraser's croft. The fog from earlier days had lifted, replaced by a restless sky rippling with dark-edged clouds. Morag's sheep huddled close to the fence, bleating irritably at the shifting air. Morag stood outside her door, arms folded, chin jutting forward as if daring the weather to knock her off balance. She didn't greet Hamish immediately. She simply watched him come closer, her face set in that habitual mask of pride. "You've come about that woman's tale," she said before he spoke. Hamish nodded. "Angela Sinclair said she saw you with a lantern late the night Gavin died." Morag snorted. "Then Angela Sinclair needs her eyes washed. I was walking but nowhere near his cottage. Couldn't sleep, my mind was churned up." She glanced toward the hills, eyes narrowing. "Folk here don't like talking about nerves, but I'll tell you straight. I was rattled. The man upset me, stirred up old shame about my father's land. So I walked." "Why not say so earlier?" Hamish asked gently. "Because it's none of anyone's business," she said bluntly. "Folk love knowing your weaknesses. Gives them something to chew on in church." Hamish listened to her voice, the rawness beneath the bark. Morag rarely admitted to nerves or shame. That she'd done so now told him her honesty outweighed her stubbornness. Lugs sniffed at her boots, then wandered off to investigate a clump of grass. A dog's judgment carried weight. Lugs didn't sense fear in Morag, nor guilt. Hamish asked, "Did you go near Gavin's house at all?" "No." Her answer was firm, steady. "I walked past the kirk and back again. Ask Mrs. Baird next door. My lantern woke her up. She'll complain gladly." Hamish almost smiled. "I believe you." Morag's shoulders loosened a fraction. "Good, because that Sinclair woman, something's off with her. Too prim, too watchful." It aligned with Hamish's own unease. He thanked Morag and followed the narrow track back toward the holiday cottages. The wind had grown stronger now, tossing branches and driving a line of cold air straight down the back of his coat. Angela Sinclair's rented cottage sat at the far edge of the village, half hidden behind a row of scraggly bushes that never seemed sure whether they wanted to live or die. Smoke rose thinly from the chimney, but no warmth touched the windows. Hamish knocked lightly. After a moment, the door opened just enough for Angela's narrow face to appear. Her eyes shifted quickly between Hamish, the road, and Lugs. "Oh dear," she breathed. "Is something wrong?" "Not wrong," Hamish said softly. "Just a few questions." She hesitated, then stepped aside. The cottage interior hit Hamish instantly. Its tidiness was unnatural. Holiday renters were rarely so precise. The table was bare save for a bowl of fruit that looked as though it had been placed there for show. The counters were spotless. Even the armchair cushions sat too neatly, like untouched props rather than lived-in furniture. "You keep things tidy," Hamish said casually. Angela gave a startled laugh, high-pitched. "Oh yes, Terribly tidy. I'm a dreadful neat freak. Hamish nodded, eyes drifting over the mantelpiece. No photographs, no books other than the ones already provided by the holiday agency, no stray scarves or half-read magazines. Nothing belonging to her except a handbag hung with unnatural care on the back of a chair. He approached the window, gaze following the seam where the curtain hung crookedly. Behind the fabric, barely visible, was a stack of papers hurriedly tucked to the side. Angela shifted uneasily. "Holiday paperwork," she said too quickly. "I'm frightfully disorganized, really." Hamish's internal voice uttered a small dry "I," right. "You mentioned before that Gavin threatened you," he said. "Said he'd ruin your chances at buying Croft land." Angela swallowed, her throat tight. Yes, he did." "Funny," Hamish murmured, "because Gavin told folk nobody else was interested in buying. Said he was the only one with vision." Angela paled. "Well, he didn't want competition." Hamish stepped closer, not intimidating, simply present. "Can I see the paperwork you tucked behind the curtain, Mrs. Sinclair?" Angela froze. Those are just property valuations. For fun. You know how some people browse catalogues?" Hamish didn't blink. "May I?" After a long pause, she nodded stiffly. Hamish lifted the curtain and pulled out the stack. Indeed, property valuations. Several, all showing crofts around Loch-Dubh. Some marked with notes. Gavin Forbes's own proposed plots had been circled heavily. Angela watched him with her hands twisted tightly together. "You're not here for a holiday," Hamish said quietly. Angela sat down abruptly. "I wanted a place. A small croft, something peaceful. My husband passed 2 years ago." Her voice shook slightly. "I thought a fresh start up here might do me good. Then I met Gavin. He said he had big plans, that he'd buy the land before anyone else. He laughed about it. Laughed at me." Hamish heard the scrape of wounded pride beneath her words. "You said he threatened you?" She nodded. "He told me I was wasting my time, that he'd make sure no seller would take me seriously. He said he'd ruin my chances. Those were his exact words." She paused, fingers trembling slightly. "But I never touched him. I was frightened of him, not the other way around." Her story was too tidy, too rehearsed, but not malicious. She was lying about parts, a detail here, a motive there, but she wasn't the killer. Hamish trusted that instinct more than anything. He folded the papers neatly and handed them back. "You should have told me the truth straight away." She gave a weak smile. "Folk here don't take kindly to newcomers with ambitions." "That depends on the ambitions," Hamish said gently, "and how loud they're spoken." He stepped outside. The sky had darkened further. Thick clouds rolled in from the west, bruising the horizon. Lugg stood stiffly, nose lifted, sensing the shift in pressure. A storm was weaving itself through the hills. As Hamish walked, the wind tugged at his coat, snatching leaves from the ground and tossing them through the air. Loch-Dubh felt tight, wound like a drumhead. Every croft carried tension. Every villager had something to hide or something they feared losing. Halfway back to the station, Hamish paused to glance toward the moors. The distant hills were already obscured by sheets of rain sweeping in. A single gull circled low over the loch, calling out sharply before veering inland, seeking shelter. Luggs nudged Hamish's hand, eyes shining with quiet worry. "Aye, lad," Hamish said softly. "There's a blow coming, and not just the weather." He resumed walking, boots crunching on the damp gravel, the storm clouds pulling tighter behind him. Something in the village was shifting, tipping toward revelation or danger. Angela's lies, Morag's honesty, Colin's fear, the sheep's return, the glove, all of it threaded together. But the next piece was still hidden. Hamish walked on, Luggs matching him step for step, the wind rising as if urging them forward into whatever lay ahead. The fog rolled in just after dusk, thick as wool and cold as a church crypt. It crept along the lanes, swallowing fences and hedges until Loch-Dubh became a world of muted shapes and muffled sounds. Hamish stood outside the station with Luggs at his side, feeling the damp air slide down the back of his neck. Somewhere across the village a dog barked, its voice oddly distant in the fog, the sound warped by the heavy air. Luggs pressed close to Hamish's leg, tail low, body alert. "Aye, lad," Hamish murmured. The place feels queer tonight." Inside the station, the air was no warmer. Hamish lit the small lamp on his desk and fed a few pieces of peat into the stove, but the fire only managed a faint glow. The lines on the old maps he'd been studying looked smudged in the dim light. The boundary stone he'd uncovered, the torn jacket, the glove, all of it pointed toward old grudges and fresh fear. Just as he settled into the creaking chair, the landline rang. The sound was sharp, startling in the hush. Hamish lifted the receiver. Static crackled like frying fat. Then a distorted voice whispered, harsh and breathless, "Leave the matter be." Hamish sat straighter. "Who's this?" Another hiss of static. "Leave it. For your own good. For everyone's good." The fog outside seemed to thicken as the voice dropped to a final rasp. "Stop asking questions." The call ended. The dial tone buzzed weakly, then died. Hamish set the receiver down slowly. Anonymous warnings weren't common in Lochdup. Folk here preferred insults face to face, which meant whoever had called was frightened enough to hide. Luggs whined and nudged Hamish's hand. "I know," Hamish said softly. "Cowards love the phone." He stepped outside, locking the station door behind him. The fog swallowed him at once. The familiar shapes of the cottages blurred into shadows. The loch was invisible, though he could hear faint waves tapping against the stones like fingers. Cold droplets clung to his hair. Lochdup in fog always felt older, as if stepping into its past, into a place where grudges ran deeper than the loch itself. Hamish walked the path toward his own small home. Luggs kept close, his body brushing against Hamish's leg. Every movement echoed strangely. Footsteps on wet gravel sounded too loud, then too soft. The wind barely stirred. Halfway down the road, Hamish paused. Something shifted in the mist, a faint outline, half seen. Luggs froze, ears forward, muscles tight. Hamish lifted his head. "Who's there?" No answer. Only the drip of moisture from unseen branches. He took another step. The shadow moved, and then the shape lunged. A long wooden crook swung through the fog, aimed at Hamish's shoulder. Instinct saved him. He ducked, the crook slicing the air beside his ear with a faint whistle. Luggs barked, sharp and furious. Hamish stepped back, heart thudding once, hard. "Stop that! Show yourself!" The attacker hesitated. He sensed it, a flicker of uncertainty. The crook trembled ever so slightly. Then the figure dropped it and fled. Footsteps pounded through the fog, fast and uneven. Hamish ran a few paces after them, but the thick air swallowed the shape whole. Only the echo of fleeing boots remained. He stopped, breath white in the cold. Luggs growled at the darkness, then fell silent. "Someone panicked," Hamish muttered. "Panicked bad." He bent to pick up the crook. Old wood, worn smooth by years of use. A shepherd's tool. One of the crofters, then, or someone desperate enough to take one from a shed. Not a calculated attack. A warning. A fearful, clumsy attempt to scare him off. Hamish ran his thumb over the crooked handle. No blood. No real weight behind the swing. Whoever it was had no wish to kill him, only to frighten him. And fear often made fools bold. "Aye," he said softly to Luggs. "That narrows things." And they walked the rest of the way home in cautious silence. Hamish kept glancing into the swirling fog, but saw nothing more. Even the lights from the houses glowed weakly, blurred halos in the damp. When he reached his cottage, he lit the lamp and hung his coat near the fire. The peat glowed warmly, sending out sweet, earthy smoke. Luggs settled near the hearth, still restless but grateful for the warmth. Hamish poured himself tea, strong, almost bitter, and sat down at the table. The crook lay beside the cup. Water dripped from its end onto the wood. "Someone's scared of me knowing too much, lad," Hamish said. "But they're scared enough to make mistakes." He thought again of the boundary stone. Moved, replaced, hidden. The square shape left in the mud. A deliberate act and done recently. How many in Lochdup had reason to tamper with it? Morag, with her father's honour hanging over her head. Colin, whose grazing rights depended on old lines. Angela, whose documents hinted at ambitions she tried to hide. And others, people who pretended indifference but watched him with guarded eyes when he passed. Hamish rubbed the bridge of his nose. He hated paperwork, hated bureaucracy, but he loved this, piecing together the small human truths hidden beneath pride and fear. Another gust rattled the window. The fog thickened outside, turning the glass into a dull mirror. Hamish stood and walked to the door, looking out across the invisible village. Somewhere out there, a frightened person was pacing in circles, half regretting the swing of that crook, half determined to keep him from digging further. Old land, old grudges, lines drawn in earth that had shifted too many times. He stepped back inside, bolting the door more out of habit than fear. He sat again, watching Lugs, who finally relaxed enough to lie down fully, chin on paws, though his ears still flicked at every creak. Hamish picked up the crook and studied it one last time before setting it aside. "A crofter's hand," he murmured. But which one? Images formed quickly in his mind. Not vivid, just quiet impressions. Colin's nervous twitch, Morag's trembling anger, Angela's watchful stillness, the sheep returning to the scene, the smell of sheep dip on Gavin's jacket. Pieces, but not the pattern yet. The boundary stone, always the boundary stone. Hamish stood and walked to the stove, stoking the peat to bring the fire back to life. Sparks drifted upward, glowing briefly before fading. Outside, the fog pressed thick against the walls, making the cottage feel smaller, more intimate. "A person lies in wait with a crook," he said softly. "That's no murderer seeking to kill. That's someone desperate." He returned to the window, peering again into the swirling grey. "And desperate folk," he whispered, "always trip themselves up." The fog seemed to pulse with the storm brewing far beyond the hills. The air held a weight that warned him the night wasn't done yet, that someone out there was pacing in fear, hoping Hamish would heed the warning and give up. But he wouldn't. Hamish Macbeth had never been one to leave a matter be, not when truth lay crouched beneath old Highland soil. Lugs rose and pressed his nose against Hamish's hand, sensing the shift in his thoughts, the quiet resolve taking shape. "Aye, boy," Hamish murmured. "We'll get to the heart of it, fog or no fog." He dimmed the lamp, leaving only the fire's glow flickering across the small, cluttered room. Maps piled on the chair, teacup half finished, the crook leaning against the wall like a reminder. The night outside pressed close, and the truth waited somewhere within it. Dawn drifted into Loch Dubh with the quiet reluctance of a shy guest. A thin wash of pale light spread over the moors, softening the jagged silhouettes of heather and rock. Mist still clung low to the ground, drifting in slow breaths as if the land itself were waking with caution. Hamish walked the narrow, uneven path with Lugs trotting ahead, the dog's tail stiff and ears pricked. There was something in the air, a faint disturbance, almost a tremor. Hamish breathed in the cold morning air. It cleared his mind in a way nothing else ever managed. He thought best out here, with nothing but the wind and the quiet company of Lugs. The village was still asleep, but worry hung over it like a cloud. Gavin Forbes's death had unsettled the crofters more than they let on. Old grudges had begun to stir. Lugs paused suddenly, paws planted firmly in the soft peat. He sniffed the ground, then followed an invisible line through the grass, stopping at a patch where mud had been disturbed. Hamish crouched beside him. Fresh footprints, deep, recent, and moving in a straight path from the direction of Colin MacLean's croft. Hamish traced the edges with his fingers. Same tread pattern he'd seen beside Gavin's shed days earlier. "Colin," Hamish murmured, "what have ye done?" He stood slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. The sun remained trapped behind the mist, spreading only a faint glow across the hills. Hamish followed the prints. They led toward the loch, dragging slightly in places as though someone had walked with uncertainty, or guilt pressing heavily on their steps. Lugs walked beside him, gaze fixed ahead. When they reached the slight dip in the land where the path split, one fork toward Colin's croft, the other toward the water, Lugs gave a soft growl and moved toward the croft. Hamish followed. Colin MacLean stood outside his shed, fumbling with a rope that didn't need fumbling. His face was pale, his hair uncombed, his movements jerky. He looked like a man whose sleep had been tugged away by something heavier than nightmares. He jumped when he saw Hamish. "Morning," he said, voice shaking around the edges. "Early start for you." Hamish gave a small nod. "Aye, the moors are clearer in the morning." Colin swallowed hard. "Aye, clearer." Hamish walked closer. Lugs stayed at his heel, eyes fixed on Colin. The dog didn't growl this time, but his body was tense, a wire pulled too tightly. Hamish's voice remained soft. "You've been out early yourself." Colin stiffened. A man's work is never done. Hamish studied him. The crofter's hands were trembling slightly, though he tried to hide it by gripping the rope harder. I found footprints, Hamish said, fresh, from your croft, toward the loch. Colin's breath hitched. A lot of folk walk that way. Not with your boots. Hamish's tone was gentle, not accusing, and not the same tread I saw at Gavin's shed. Colin's hands froze on the rope. He stared at the ground. A long silence stretched, broken only by the wind brushing against the old croft walls. Hamish stepped closer still. Colin, you need to tell me the truth. I'm not here to ruin you. I'm here to understand. Colin's jaw worked as though he were trying to chew back words. His shoulders sagged. The rope fell from his hands. I didn't mean it, he whispered. Hamish, I swear to you, I didn't mean it. Hamish held his silence, giving Colin the quiet space he needed to let the confession rise on its own. Colin rubbed at his eyes with the back of his sleeve. He was digging. His voice trembled. Digging and digging into things best left alone. You mean the boundary stone? Colin swallowed hard. Aye, he found it. The old one. The one that marks the rights. He dug it up, Colin whispered. Dragged the true stone out of the ground and left it sitting there, like a judgment. All the old trickery plain as day. He looked toward the hills as though the land itself were listening. It was moved, long before my time. My grandfather, maybe, or his father. I dinna ken, but all my grazing rights depend on it. He paced a step, agitation building. Gavin said he'd expose it. Said the land wasn't mine. Said he'd buy it out from under me once the truth was out. Colin laughed, a small, broken sound. All my life, Hamish, all my life I've worked that ground. It's all I am. Hamish stood still, letting the man unravel his story without interruption. I went to speak with him, Colin said, just to talk, to calm things down. He was by the loch, walking the shore. I told him he didn't understand. I told him the past is tangled, that Highland land is more than lines on a map. But he wouldn't listen. He called me a thief. Colin's voice cracked. He called my father a thief. Lugs let out a soft, mournful sound. We argued, Colin whispered. I was angry. Shame makes a man angrier than anything else. He stepped back, tripped on a root, and I shoved him. Just once. Not hard. Only to get some space. Colin's hands trembled as though feeling the moment again. He fell, hit his head on a stone just under the water. It happened so fast. 1 second he was shouting, the next. He was lying still. I panicked. I knelt beside him, tried to wake him, but he was already gone. Hamish looked at the crofter, seeing not a criminal but a frightened man bearing the weight of a mistake too heavy to lift. What did you do then? Hamish asked gently. I dragged him a little, Colin said, ashamed, into the shallows. I remembered the sheep had been wandering loose, so I pushed them back toward the loch. Thought it'd look like he slipped trying to chase them. He shook his head, tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. Fool thing to do, but I was desperate. I thought if folk knew the truth about the boundary, they'd say I'd done it deliberately. Hamish's heart ached with a quiet loneliness. This was Loch Dubh, pride, shame and fear woven so tightly that a man couldn't always tell one from the other. Why didn't you come to me? Hamish asked softly. Colin laughed miserably. Because you always find the truth, Hamish, and I wasn't ready to face it. He hesitated, then added in a low, ashamed voice, I was that scared I did daft things. It was me phoned you that night, from the box by the kirk, told you to leave it be. He swallowed hard. And when you did nay, I panicked again, took the crook, waited in the fog like a fool and swung it near you. I never meant to hurt you, Hamish. I just wanted you frightened off. I was that scared I did daft things, Colin went on, voice rough. It was me phoned you that night, from the box by the kirk, told you to leave it be. He swallowed, shame burning in his cheeks. And when you did nay, I lost my head again. Took the crook, waited in the fog like some coward and swung it near you. I'd never have hit you proper, Hamish. I just wanted you frightened off. He shook his head miserably, made everything worse, like a fool. A long moment passed. The wind eased. The mist thinned just enough to show a faint shimmer of the loch in the distance. Hamish stepped forward, resting a gentle hand on Colin's shoulder. It was wrong, but it wasn't murder in cold blood. You panicked. Folk will understand that better than you think. Colin shook his head, tears finally escaping. I've ruined everything. No, Hamish said quietly. You made a terrible mistake, but you're not a bad man. Lugs pressed against Colin's leg as if offering forgiveness only a dog could give. Colin looked down at him, bewildered by the gesture. Hamish took a slow breath. The truth had settled, heavy, human, and painfully ordinary. Nothing dramatic, nothing cruel, just a desperate crofter, a misplaced stone, a lifetime of honour and fear colliding on the edge of the loch. Come on, Hamish said softly. We'll go to the station. You'll tell me everything again. Properly. Colin nodded, defeated but relieved in the way a man feels when the worst burden has finally slipped from his shoulders. They walked together toward the village. The mist lifted slightly, as though the land itself sighed. Hamish glanced once toward the moors, the old fields, the ancient grudges, the line of earth that had caused so much pain. History had killed Gavin Forbes as much as Colin had, and now the truth would ripple through Loch like a chill wind. But for the moment, all was quiet. The morning broke with a washed-out sky, the kind that looked as though the sun had tried to rise and promptly given up. A sharp wind swept through Loch, carrying the smell of damp stone and peat smoke. Hamish stood outside the station with lugs pressed against his leg, the dog uneasy at the tension hanging in the air. Somewhere down the road, a crofter's truck rattled past, its engine protesting the cold. Hamish had already made the dreaded call to Strathbane. He had done it quietly, without fuss, giving the facts in his usual understated manner. Colin MacLean had come willingly, sitting in the small waiting room now, hands clasped, head bowed, a man hollowed by guilt rather than hardened by crime. Lugs watched the door anxiously, sensing the heaviness that had settled over them all. Hamish rubbed the dog's head. Aye, lad, it'll not be pleasant. They didn't have to wait long. The screech of tyres shattered the quiet as Blair's police car slid to a graceless halt outside the station. Moments later, Blair himself heaved out, coat flapping like an angry sail, face flushed with excitement rather than cold. Anderson followed behind him, eyes darting nervously, clutching a notebook he had no intention of using. Well, Macbeth, Blair roared, his voice loud enough to wake the dead. So you finally did something useful. Hamish kept his expression mild. Morning, sir. Blair marched right up to him, chest puffed out. You could have botched the whole thing if I hadn't been on my way. Lucky I was here to sort it. He leaned closer, breath thick with whatever he'd had for breakfast. Where's the murderer? Hamish gestured inside. Colin's waiting. Waiting, Blair spat. Confessed already? Aye. Blair smirked as though he'd personally wrung the confession from Colin with nothing but his brilliance. Right, bring him out. Press'll be here any minute. Hamish blinked. Press? Aye, the local papers. They want a story, and I'll give them one. Strathbane can look good for once. Hamish didn't bother arguing. Blair was a storm that blew itself out only by shouting. Still, a small flicker of irritation sparked under Hamish's ribs. Colin's confession wasn't entertainment. It was a sad, human thing, a mistake that had ruined a life. Blair stomped inside. Hamish followed quietly, lugs padding behind. Colin sat where Hamish had left him, pale but composed. His eyes lifted when Hamish approached, searching his face for something, reassurance maybe. Hamish offered a small nod. Blair barged in. Right, MacLean, up you get. You're under arrest for the murder of Gavin Forbes. Colin stood slowly. It was an accident. Aye, so you say, Blair said with a cruel curl of the lip. But we'll see what the courts make of your wee accidents. Hamish felt a tightening in his chest but said nothing. He placed a steadying hand on Colin's arm as he guided him toward the door, not for Blair's benefit, but for the crofter's dignity. Colin swallowed hard and walked on. Outside, 2 reporters, eager, breathless and city-dressed, were already waiting beside their car. They perked up when they saw Blair dragging Colin forward. There he is, Blair barked triumphantly, caught by excellent Strathbane police work, a difficult case solved by me personally. Hamish almost choked on his own breath. Even Anderson looked startled. The reporters scribbled furiously. One of them asked, Was it true the constable here made the discovery? She gestured toward Hamish. Blair shoved himself forward. Macbeth? Oh, no. He was muddling around with his sheep and wasting time. I directed the whole investigation. You can quote me on that. Hamish felt the old, familiar mix of resignation and faint amusement. Blair needed praise like sheep needed grass. It was no use denying him. The villagers standing nearby exchanged looks, unimpressed. Lockdoub knew who had done the real work. Colin was placed in the back of the police car. Blair shut the door with theatrical force before turning back to the press, eager to repeat his victory tale. Hamish didn't listen. He stepped away, lugs following closely. From her croft porch, Morag Fraser stood watching. Her posture was rigid, but her face carried a complicated ache. Relief that the truth was finally known, sorrow for Colin's downfall, and weary resentment of the land disputes that had cursed their families for generations. When Hamish approached, she lifted her chin. "He's no a bad man, Hamish." "I ken that," Hamish said softly. "He was foolish, aye, but no cruel." "Not cruel," Hamish agreed. "Just frightened." Morag nodded once sharply as though sealing the thought inside her. She turned away, wiping at her eyes quickly, unwilling to let anyone see tears. Highland pride was stitched into her bones. Down the road, a small bus idled in front of the post office. Angela Sinclair stood nearby with a single suitcase, her cardigan pulled tight as she spoke briefly to Mrs. Baird. Her face was drawn, guilty without crime, ashamed without cause. She boarded the bus quietly, never glancing back at Lochdup. Hamish watched her go. She had come seeking a new beginning, but found herself tangled in old Highland history. The bus pulled away, disappearing around the bend, leaving only a faint diesel scent behind. The fog had drifted off, replaced by a cold, clear breeze. Hamish turned toward the hotel, where a familiar figure stepped out onto the gravel. Priscilla Halberton Smythe, elegant, calm, poised without effort. Her blonde hair was neatly pinned, and her pale coat looked as though mist dared not cling to it. She walked toward him with that restrained grace she possessed effortlessly. "Hamish," she said quietly. He felt that small, reluctant twist in his chest. "Morning, Priscilla." "I heard it was Colin," she said, voice soft. "I'm sorry, for everyone involved." Hamish nodded. "Aye, a sad business." They stood side by side, watching the village stir, tourists wandering uncertainly, crofters murmuring among themselves, Blair still posing for the press like a rooster. "You handled it kindly," Priscilla said. "You always do." Hamish looked down, embarrassed by praise from her of all people. "I just tried to do right by them." "You did?" Her voice held that familiar warmth she never allowed to grow too close. "Lochdup is lucky to have you." For a moment, Hamish imagined saying something more, something honest about how she unsettled him, how she belonged to a world he could never enter, how her kindness made loneliness sit heavier in his chest. But he said nothing. He never did. Priscilla offered a small, wistful smile. Then she drew back gently, the moment closing like a door. "I'll let you get on." Before Hamish could muster a proper reply, she turned and walked back toward the hotel, her steps soft on the damp gravel. Lugs nudged Hamish's knee. "Aye," Hamish muttered. "I know." The village grew quieter as the reporters left, as Blair sped off with sirens blaring unnecessarily, as crofters retreated to their morning chores. Lochdup felt bruised, uneasy, unsettled, but not broken. The truth, however painful, had settled into the soil. Hamish walked slowly toward the loch, the cold wind brushing against his face. Lugs trotted beside him, tail swinging low. The water glimmered faintly beneath the pale sky, as though trying to forget the secrets it had held. Another case finished, another reminder that Highland life was stitched from pride, shame, small lies, and old sorrows. And Hamish, quiet, gentle Hamish, felt all of it more deeply than he ever let on. The weather cleared as if the sky, exhausted by days of worry, had finally allowed itself a long breath. Sunlight, thin but honest, fell over Lochdup, turning the damp roofs into dull gold and smoothing the moors into gentle folds of colour. A calm breeze drifted across the loch, stirring the reeds just enough to remind the village that storms always passed one way or another. Hamish stepped out of his cottage with Lugs trotting at his heel, tail swinging loose for the first time in days. The dog paused to sniff the air, testing it, and seemed satisfied. Whatever unease had plagued him had finally loosened its grip. Hamish felt it too, not relief exactly, but a softening. The worst of the business was behind them. Now came the part Loch-Dubh excelled at. Rumour, half-truth, self-important retellings, and quiet, lifelong grudges slipping back into place like old stones. He reached Patel's shop just as Mr. Patel was rearranging a stack of tinned tomatoes with the weary air of a man personally wronged by the world's foolishness. "Constable Macbeth," Patel said immediately, not even looking up. "You must tell the tourists to stop asking about the murderer Crofter. I run a respectable shop, not a crime museum." Hamish lifted an eyebrow. "I've not encouraged them." "They think because you solved a case they can buy a postcard and pester me with questions," Patel grumbled. "One woman asked if I sold stones from the crime scene. Stones, as though I collect them in jars." Hamish hid a smile. "It'll die down." "I doubt that," Patel said darkly. "People love terrible stories. Never mind who they hurt." A small, uncomfortable truth. Hamish gave him a gentle nod and stepped back outside before Patel's irritation gathered speed. Across the square, the Curry sisters were already perched on their bench like two gossiping crows. Jessie Curry spotted Hamish and waved with alarming enthusiasm. "There he is!" Jessie cried. "Hamish Macbeth, our brave constable. Nearly murdered he was, struck down by a great hulking villain in the fog." Hamish sighed inwardly. "It wasn't quite like that." Jessie ignored him entirely. "He dodged the blow. Near acrobatics, they say." Luggs huffed, unimpressed. Hamish said mildly, "All that happened was someone panicked." Nessie Curry leaned forward, eyes wide. "But you were attacked. We heard it from Mrs. Mackay's niece's husband's cousin. She says you were left half dead." "I was fine," Hamish said, though he knew it was pointless. Once the Currys chose a version of events, it hardened like cement. "Oh, he's modest," Jessie said, patting his arm dramatically. "Nearly killed, and he won't admit it." Hamish extricated his sleeve politely and continued on, Luggs glancing up at him with a dog's version of sympathy. "I ken," Hamish muttered. "Best not argue with them." Outside the hotel, Mrs. Sinclair, no relation to Angela, was polishing the brass handle on the door. She straightened as Hamish passed. "We're expecting a fishing tour," she announced with the pride of a general planning battle. "All the rooms booked. If any of them ask about the murder, I shall charge them extra." Hamish schooled his expression. "That seems fair." "It is," she said briskly. "Tourists come here for trout, not tragedy." Inside the hotel, he glimpsed the staff bustling with renewed purpose, polishing glasses, arranging menus, pretending Loch-Dubh was a perfectly ordinary, peaceful place untouched by scandal. As he walked on, he noticed more changes. Small, telling ones. Fences along the crofts were being shifted quietly. A few posts dug up, others moved a foot or two. Without fuss, without announcement, the crofters had decided to adjust their lines to reflect the true boundaries. Not out of obedience to the law, Hamish suspected, but out of shame, out of a desire to mend something that had festered too long. Old Colin MacLean's sheepdog barked in the distance, unsettled by his master's absence. Hamish paused a moment, feeling a tug in his chest. Colin was no murderer in the way Blair would proudly claim. He was a frightened man caught between history and fear. Loch-Dubh understood such things better than any court in Strathbane. By the Kirk Hall he heard raised voices, a lively argument among fishermen debating whose rumours about the murder had been closest to the truth. Hamish didn't go near them. He already knew none of them had been remotely close. A pair of tourists walked past him next, whispering loudly enough for him to hear. "That's him, the constable who chased the killer through the fog." Hamish kept walking. Correcting tourists was a game he had no interest in playing. By midday, Loch-Dubh looked almost normal again. Smoke curled steadily from chimneys. Boats bobbed gently by the jetty. Crofters trudged across fields, dogs at their heels, settling fences and clearing debris. The world, with its stubborn way, kept moving. Hamish wandered to the loch's edge, Luggs trotting ahead to sniff the reeds. The water gleamed under the clearing sky, calm, deceptive, pretending it had never held a body or a secret. Hamish stood there a long moment, letting the wind pass over him, carrying whispers of heather and mud. Luggs returned, sat beside him and leaned against his leg. "Aye," Hamish murmured. "It's over now. Mostly." Loch-Dubh would never be free of grudges or gossip or petty wars. That was its life, but it had steadied the way the loch steadied after a storm. Hamish reached down to scratch Luggs's ears. The dog finally relaxed fully, eyes half closed, the strain of the past days melting away. And for a moment, just a small one, Hamish felt something like peace settle in his chest. Life resumed, quiet, imperfect, human, Loch-Dubh's way. Snow had begun to fall by late afternoon, drifting down in slow, uncertain flakes that looked almost embarrassed to be arriving after so much rain. The moors softened under the white dusting, the sharp edges of heather fading into gentle mounds. Loch-Dubh settled into a hush, the kind of quiet that felt older than the village itself. Hamish returned to the station with Lugs trotting faithfully beside him. The dog shook himself at the doorway, scattering snow across the floorboards. Hamish didn't bother sweeping it away. The place was already a muddle of boots, maps, and old reports he had no real intention of completing. He lit the peat fire, watching the flames catch slowly, curling around the bricks with a faint crackle. The warmth eased into the room bit by bit, pushing back the cold that had clung to the walls all day. Hamish lowered himself into the worn armchair, its springs protesting softly. Lug circled twice, then curled at his feet with a sigh. The room smelled of peat smoke, damp wool, and the faint trace of tea leaves. Outside, the snow thickened, falling with a gentle insistence. Hamish sat quietly, letting the warmth seep into him. These were the moments he felt most himself. No bustle, no Blair shouting, no reporters scribbling nonsense, no villagers spinning tales. Just the fire, the dog, and the deep hum of the Highlands. The case had ended, as they all did, with no fanfare. No villain dragged from a lair, no thrilling chase. Just people, flawed, frightened people caught in the tangles of their own history. Gavin Forbes had not been a monster. He'd been reckless, ambitious, unkind in small but harmful ways. Colin MacLean had not been violent. He'd been desperate, cornered by old shame and the threat of losing everything he believed defined him. Hamish stared at the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "A daft, needless death," he murmured, "because folk dinna ken how to let go of the past." He felt that familiar heaviness, the quiet sorrow that always came after a case. Solving it never left him satisfied. Instead, it left a hollow space, as though he'd walked through someone else's grief and brought a bit of it home with him. Lugs lifted his head, sensing the shift in Hamish's mood. His warm nose nudged Hamish's hand. Hamish smiled faintly and scratched behind his ears. "Aye, I'm fine, lad, just thinking." The dog settled again, content. The snow pressed against the windows, soft and steady. Somewhere outside, a sheep bleated faintly, the sound carried by the stillness. Loch-Dubh felt wrapped in cotton. Safe, at least for tonight. Hamish leaned back, letting his gaze wander across the cluttered room. A chipped mug waited on the table. An old tartan blanket hung crooked on the back of the chair. A stack of unread novels sat near the stove, gifts from villagers who assumed he had more leisure time than he ever did. He rubbed his forehead thoughtfully. The village needed him, not because he was brilliant or strong or dramatic, but because he understood them. Their small lies, their pride, their shame, their quiet kindnesses hidden beneath bluster. And they trusted him, even when they didn't say so. He supposed that was enough. He took a slow sip of tea, lukewarm now, but comforting. The fire snapped softly, sending a tiny spark dancing upward before fading into darkness. The snow outside thickened further, coating the village roofs, muting every sound until even the loch seemed to hold its breath. Lights from distant crofts glowed dimly through the haze, each one a small, stubborn beacon of Highland life. Hamish felt the tension in his chest ease. The emptiness was still there, but softened, gentler. Acceptance drifted in with the quiet warmth of the peat smoke. He glanced down at Lugs. "Tomorrow will be better," he whispered. Lugs wagged his tail once in reply, the soft thump against the floorboards echoing in the still room. Hamish closed his eyes briefly, listening to the quiet crackle of the fire, the steady beat of the snow, the gentle breathing of the dog who had stood by him through storms and fog and foolish villagers. Outside, the world lay still under its new blanket of white. The sheep were safe in their fields again, their panic long faded into memory. Crofters sat by their own fires, muttering about the weather and fixing fences in their minds. The hotel windows glowed with soft lamplight, promising warmth to any traveller who braved the cold. Loch-Dubh slept in its winter hush, the village curled beneath snow and silence. And in the small police station, Hamish Macbeth, tall, lanky, gentle, quietly lonely, sat by his hearth with Lugs, warming his hands and his heart in equal measure. Another case done. Another night falling softly over the highlands. The fire flickered once, casting a final glow across the room. Hamish opened his eyes, breathed in the scent of peat and snow, and let the peace settle.